on the doorway or window facing the south was a timepiece. The women were models of industry. With the click of the wool card, the swift of the reel, and the busy hum of the spinning wheel. The bridges for footmen in these days were large trees felled across the streams. In 1816, the first election for governor with 125 votes were cast. In 1820, 161 votes were cast. Postage in those days was 25 cents, 18 and a half cents, 12 and a half cents, and 10 cents. It depended upon the size. The first lawyer was Philetus Chamberlain. The second was Denton Short. No supervisor elected before 1840. Early exports from the town were carted to Charlotte and was whiskey, cider, and potash. Surplus grain was purchased from the settlers by the hotel keepers, and also to feed the hogs, the sheep, and the cattle being driven to Albany. Later, flour and grain were carted to Pittsburgh to be sent by the Erie Canal, by the way of the Erie Canal. The population in 1791 was 3. In 1840, it was 3,000. On the front of the Christian church were inscribed in letters and figures of stone, Christian Chapel, 1840. In 1887 or 88, the church was burned. In 1841, both mills failed here. In 1842 and 43, the Millerites' excitement spread in the town. And that was the time that the people got ready for this end of the world, basically. Hunt Brothers Woolen Mill was a big establishment about 1874. Elston Hunt was superintendent of the weaving department, Arthur superintendent of the carding machine. William was a salesman. A team of horses drove through western New York within a radius of 50 miles from Honeoye Falls, and occasionally through southern tiers, being away from home for about a week. Nearly every home used flannel sheets. There were no furnace in those days. And every spring and fall, this mill did a big business washing rag carpets, which were used in all the homes. Women did not play cards or bowl and had plenty to do at their own home. And the clothes basket stood in nearly every living room, and neighbors would run in for a bit of gossip and take a thimble and needle and thread, and sew rags. No cloth was wasted in those early times. I also remember one 4th of July parade. That happened when I was about, I guess I was about 7, and now I am 86, which I hate to tell. And that was the biggest parade. They had an elephant. We were going to have an elephant. People came from miles around to see that parade. And when the elephant got right up here by the bridge, people said the bridge will never hold it. And just then, something went wrong with the apparatus, and the elephant went to pieces right then and there. And the elephant was made with Guy Pride and Addison Holden in the 2 legs, and I don't remember who was the other leg. But the people were so mad, they howled and did everything they could, but didn't do any good. The elephant had gone. Stop it. That elephant was so realistic that they had done such a good paint job on it, these two boys, that everybody thought it was the real thing. And some of the children were really afraid because he kept his, what do you call it? Trunk going, and they were so afraid that he might grab them. But nothing happened until the elephant went to pieces. Now you put it out of my head again. What was I thinking about? So at the end of the parade and the end of the day, Whiskey had been king, and there were several families. There were two in town, which were, well, they had come here to build the railroad. They were the Irishmen of the town. One family had 4 strapping boys, and the other one had 4 strapping boys, and frequently, if they didn't agree, they got into an awful fight. So the fight came on, and my father happened to be mayor of the town at the time, and one of the neighbor boys came rushing up, and he said, "Oh, Dan, come quick. They can't do anything with those men. They're killing each other." So he got up and dressed, and he had a policeman's club, which he always kept. So he rushed down to the saloon, or to the Wilcox house at that time, on the Four Corners, and sure enough, they were having a terrible fight. When my father walked in, one of these Irishmen stepped up and said, "Hi there, take your old hat off." And he had knocked my father's hat off, and my father was a man 6'2" in his stocking feet, and when he was a boy was called the Fighting Bill of Down East, and he could fight every boy in the country. So with his club he knocked 3 of those men on the floor quicker than you could say Jack Robinson. Down they went, and then the other men picked them all up bodily and carried them over to the jail. They had 8 of those fellows in the jail, this little bit of a one-horse jail on East Street opposite the Methodist Church. And after my father went home, pretty soon up came the neighbor that lived there and said, "You've got to come down and stop those men. Nobody can sleep in the whole town." So down my father went again. This time he was a Johnny Bull, and he'd got his Johnny Bull up. So he walked down there, and he walked in with his club, and he said, "Now if I hear one word out of you, I'll knock all of you on that floor so quick you won't know where you are." And then the priest came up and wanted my father to let the men go home because they had got cows to milk. And father said, "No, they can't go home till tomorrow morning. They can go home at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning because by that time they'll be sober. And they can't go until then. So your woman will have to do the milking tonight." So father went home, and there was no more heard of them. No other noise heard from them, and in the morning they were allowed to go home. Noise over here, up here where Stephens lives, and the others were, the Murray boys are still living. They live out east here. Some of them are still, not the old fellows, but the young generation. I couldn't give any names.
Yeah.
Oh, but were they fighters?
Well, they were pretty good fighters in those days.
It isn't going now, is it?
Another story is told of the late Clarence Short. He lived on Ontario Street in the house where Dr. Thompson now lives. That was the last house on the street. And he could recall when he was a little boy, about 6 years old, what excitement he would have because early morning after a Saturday night, when the men had gathered around the saloons in Honeoye Falls after a hard week's work of digging the ditches for the water work. They didn't have any machinery to do it. It was all done by hand. And the men would get so full on Saturday night that they laid all along Ontario Street under every tree. There'd be 1 or 2 men. They couldn't go any farther. So early Sunday morning, he would get his father up to take him up to see those men lying there until they got woke up. But by noon, the road was clear, and it was safe to go up that way.
Do you remember just what year it was that waterworks line went through?
Well, when Clarence Short was 8 years old, and Clarence Short would be 100 now,
Yeah.
I guess.
Well, as I understand, the first line they went through was a wooden line.
Yes,
wasn't
and it didn't work, and they had to redig it. They had to go, they put another line in, and this was the second line that they were putting in when this happened.
the second line was a cast iron
Yes, the
pipe
second line was a cast iron pipeline. Well, another thing I recall is when I was a little girl, probably 5 or 6 years old, how horrified I was because I heard the neighbors telling that a man had been buried alive in our cemetery, and how they knew it. He had been dead and buried for 2 years, and they had to move, or did move, the body in another part of the cemetery. And when they opened the casket, he had turned over in the casket and laid over on his side, and his hair had grown down about 3 feet long, his whiskers.
Do you recall when the gas line was first introduced into Honeoye Falls here?
Well, I can just remember how they were digging gas, and we were so anxious to get the gas. And we were one of the first houses, and we burned gas. We had a gas stove in every room downstairs. There were 4 gas stoves, and we burned all the gas we wanted, all the whole year, and it cost us $3 a month.
That gas comes from the Bristol Valley area?
Yes,
is that
it
right?
came from the Bristol Valley. It was $3 a month, no matter how many stoves you burned.
There are no meters at that time.
No meters, just burn your gas all you wanted to. I remember that there was no firefighting equipment, and every time there was a fire, the fire bell rang. We had just a bell in the church that would ring to tell you about the fire, and we would all start out. My father would take 1 or 2 pails, my mother 1 or 2 big pails, and I'd come along with a little bit of a pail. Now we would all go up this fire, and men would stand by the creek or maybe be pumping in a well somewhere and fill those pails and pass it on. They stand a big line of people and stand them on, or pass that pail of water along. That's all they had to fight them with.
Do you recall when that steamer was introduced in Honeoye Falls?
Yes, I do, and I know my father thought that they never could throw the water from the creek down here up as far as our house, which is up there on North Main Street near the cemetery. And so in order to prove that they could do it, they threw the water and then knocked the chimney off the house, and he had to build a new chimney, which cost him quite a sum of money. So his bet didn't pan out very well.
As I recall it, there used to be up on East Street a racetrack or something up there.
Yes, there was a racetrack up on East Street, and it was where all this new settlement is now, about opposite the Frank house up there. And, ever so many men in town had a horse that they thought could go fast. Some of them could and some of them couldn't. And they would race every Saturday afternoon. They even had a grandstand for the people to get up in to see the race. But you had to stand down on not very many people would get in that, and they didn't pay them because it wasn't safe to hold the people, and they were afraid to have it. It didn't last long, maybe 5 or 6 years. And that was bought by 5 men in Honeoye Falls who made this racetrack. With W.H. Tring, Roy, Jesse Carley, and a man by the name of Wilkinson, and I can't recall those other men just now, but there were 5 of them that bought that 5 acres of land and made a racetrack.
I suppose there was a lot of betting going on. And
Oh yes, everybody was up there to see the horses, and they could bet on them. And I might tell a story about my father had a horse, a green horse, which he had raised from a colt. And when it was 2 years old, he found he could go pretty fast. When it was 3 years old, it was the fastest horse that had ever been on that track or almost anywhere else, but he had a terrible habit. When they would walk him around to rest afterward, after he'd been blanketed, he would fall down without any provocation whatever. He'd just simply fall down, never while he was racing, but just when he was being walked around. So my father thought he would sell him if he got a chance. Well, some man in Chicago, a race a raceman in Chicago, heard of him, and he came down here, and my father took him up, and they raced the horse, and the man saw how fast he could go, so he wanted to buy him, and father said, yeah, I'll sell him. And he didn't fall down that day and walking around. Well, he brought the man home to our house, and they went out by the barn, and the man was making out a check when my daughter, 3 years old, walked out there. And she said, oh, this is the horse that falls down Tandon Till, isn't it, Grandpa? And the man said, what did you say, little girl? Oh, this is the horse that falls down Tandon Till. Well, the man stopped. He said, well, what's the trouble? He said, I know there's something about this horse isn't right. So my father told him, and the deal went off, and he lost probably $1,000 by her telling that. I can also recall my mother said when she was a little girl, and she was born in 1839, I mean. When she was a little girl, 6 years old, they lived in the country on the corner, in the house on the corner of Cheese Factory Road and Quaker Meeting House Road, where Courtney's now live. My grandfather built that house. He lived there, and all the fire they had was in a fireplace, but they also had a wood stove. And one morning they got up in cold weather, very cold, and the fire was out in both places. So my mother and her sister, who was 7 years older than she, had to go a half a mile. They gave them an iron kettle, and they went a half a mile to borrow some charcoal to start a fire. When they got home, they had whittled some wood to have it all ready to start with this charcoal, because there were no paper in those days. People didn't have any newspapers. Why, no, they never had a newspaper. And they didn't have any other paper, so they had to whittle this wood very fine. And they got this charcoal and started the fire in the fireplace, and then started the fire in the kitchen stove. But that was a pretty cold trip for two little girls.
Well, that charcoal, as you speak of, that was live coals.
That was live coals. Oh, yeah. Yes, that's the only. And they had to carry it in an iron kettle because they couldn't carry it any other way. But they went a half a mile with it, and it was still all alive when they got home.
And we complain about today's things. Tell us about that Iron Man. What happened to it?
Well, John Brooks was married that very day, and at night, one of the men that went up there after that Iron Man was at the wedding. And after the wedding was over, these men, one of them was Herb Park, one of them was Charlie Pierce, and I don't remember the others. Well, Harry Pillsbury, now I can't remember the others, went up to Avon and stole the Iron Man off from whatever building they had it on, and brought it down, and they were so afraid somebody would steal it that it was chained and padlocked to a counter in Park's store, which is where the Reeves store is today. And they kept it there until they could put it on our hall. And of course, as we all know, it's been tried several times. They've tried to get that Iron Man, but every time they've been caught at it, and he's still there and been there ever since, that must have been 1891, I think, when he was brought here. Yes, I recall Will Desmond was the other one, and I think Charles Lang was the other one, because he was a very wonderful mechanic here, and they thought he would be very good at getting it done, and he was. Also remember, the only way we've had to keep our clocks straight was by the woodworking shop, which blew a whistle, a very loud whistle, every morning at 7 o'clock when they began work, and at 1 o'clock when they began work at noon, and also at 6 o'clock, and I think they blew at 12 o'clock when at noon, but I'm not positive about that, but I know they blew at 1, and that's the only way we had to be sure we had right time. Had no telephone to go to ask what time it was. And then I remember when Roscoe Tompkinson, they bought that lower mill, and pretty soon he just thought he'd have a whistle on the mill, and he was going to get one louder than the Pierce brothers because he thought he'd just outdo them. So they wasn't so sure of their time, but the man who had charge of the whistle at the Pierce brothers was Mr. Johnson, and he never made a mistake. He kept his watch accurate. And so Tompkinson would wait till their whistle started to blow, so to be sure you had it right time, and then he'd blow his louder, and it made them. There was quite a little excitement between the two men. They never got into a fight over it, but they didn't like each other.
How long ago was it that woodworking shop burnt down there? Do you remember what?
No, but I remember the fire. I couldn't tell you how long ago it was.
Well, it wasn't too long ago because I remember I used to work in that woodworking shop myself.
Oh, did you really?
5,000, that's the biggest loss of any community in the.
Yeah.
Oh, yes, it put 100 men out of work. It put 100 men out of work, and it was too bad for Honeoye Falls, but it happened. That's all there was to it.
Years ago, there was a wooden bridge over the creek at Honeoye,
Yeah?
that railroad bridge, I mean.
Yes.
And that was a covered bridge.
Yes, and I walked through there many a time, and we'd always, we had 8 or 9 trains a day at that time, so you had to watch your time. The old stone church, you want to know about Ammonooste? Yes, I remember going there. I don't remember going when they had the services. That was before my time. But when I went there, the Salvation Army held some meetings there. I guess they were here one winter. And I used to go to the Salvation Army. Everybody did. They'd have it pretty well filled up. But the old stone church, when it first started, my father was one that led the choir. He was a very good bass singer, and he led the choir, and there were several Burtons in it that lived. All the Burtons were singers that lived here, and they were in that choir. I don't remember him telling about anybody else, but I know he was a leader of it.
That church was on Monroe Street?
That church is on Monroe Street.
About where?
Well, it's this side of Ned Wetling's house, right there, but I guess it was between, I don't know who owns those houses now. Brown lived there the last I knew. Edwin Brown. That was the very place, I think. Mm-hmm.
Tell us something about the early history of the stores of the community.
Oh, I remember when we had to go after crackers, and they were always in a barrel, and they would, a fresh barrel of crackers come in from Canandaigua, where they were made. They would come in every night on what we call the 5 o'clock train. If we wanted fresh, warm crackers, we would go to the store after that time of night and get them. And anybody could walk in the store then, help yourself to a cracker, and lots of the farmers and people wanted to go and cut off a piece of cheese and eat a piece of cheese and crackers. While the farmers would come in, hang around all day, and they wouldn't buy any dinner. They could go there and get crackers and cheese all they wanted. There never anything said about it. It was, one day there was somebody had a barrel of crackers open, and a cat got in and laid on the crackers. So that didn't hurt him any. They were just as good. Cats are just as clean.
That reminds me of the story. The fellow went into the store and he says, no, I don't want any of your crackers. They tell me the mice run over your crackers every night. He says, that ain't so. The cat sleeps in that barrel every night.
Oh, that's a good one.
Just you did.
Oh, I remember when the first automobiles, well, we had one of the first cars in town, and it was just like a buggy with rubber tires, looked just like a buggy without a horse. And we couldn't get them 2 miles out of town without we'd have to be towed in because the roads were so bad. You either went through gravel or you went through sand so deep or you went through mud. And it certainly was but it was in an automobile, and from that time on, of course, we kept getting better. And I remember the first road, oh, we thought it was wonderful, the first improved road. My, wasn't that something? And now to think they're all over creation.
On the donation party?
Go ahead.
I remember when to pay the minister, we'd have a donation. And the poor ministers, they had to take whatever the people had left from vegetables or maybe some meat that wasn't very good and anything else. And maybe they'd take a little hay or a few oats. And the poor ministers, I don't know how they did live. I don't know how in the world they ever existed with those donations, and that's all they had. One way we had of raising money for the churches was ice cream socials. And I have gone and pounded ice many a time and turned a freezer. and it wasn't very easy work either. There'd be 3 or 4 women that would freeze maybe 10 or 12 or 15 gallons of ice cream, and oh, we thought it was wonderful.
As I recall it, the post office used to be in where Snoddy's place is at the present time.
Yep, I remember that very well.
And where did the post office move from there?
It went over where a part of the Emledge Pharmacy is now. There was a building there. I mean, they took out that petition. It faced on Monroe Street, and the door is still there that faced on, I guess now it faces on Main and Monroe, but that was the door into the post office. And there was the drugstore, of course, was the other side, as it always is, but the post office was there. I remember that very well. The one post office I remember was somewhere up near, well, I don't know where it could have been, up by the bank, where the bank is somewhere. There was a post office. I guess the building was gone. I don't remember. I can just remember years ago that's where the first post office was that I ever went to as a little girl. Then the next one was down where the Snoddies are, and then over there where Roy Earl was postmaster and John Fitzgerald in that corner post office.
The one on the corner you speak of, is that where Jess Buckland had a store?
Yes,
there
Jess
later?
Buchan had a store there later.
And then the post office moved over into Temple
In
Building?
the Temple Building, and that's where George Case and Bill Fairbairn were
Yeah.
very much in evidence, and Lyle Krieger ended that time.
Then the government built us a new post office on the site of the
Yes,
Catholic
sir, the
Church.
Catholic Church, and I've been in that Catholic Church many times.
And Lyle Krieger started in there as a clerk and then advanced to assistant
Yes.
postmaster, and today he is postmaster.
So it was in that corner building before it went over to the Snoddy building, sure, yes. That was, I can't remember the date, but I remember going to the post office, and there were 2 different postmasters there. I can remember the first Sunday school picnics. They were held up in the woods down back of where McCabe now lives, and it's now, I guess, the Wolfburger Park, but there were 3 woods came together there, and there was a Sunday school picnic always held there, and the school picnics were held there, and the people from Honeoye Falls, wherever they lived, walked up there and walked down to those woods, which was a good long walk, and nobody thought anything about riding. They all walked, and to that picnic they came. And they had loads and loads of food. There was no ice cream in those days, but the cakes and the chickens, everybody would go. I remember my mother would carry probably 3 dozen or 4 dozen. There were only 3 of us. She would carry, I'll say, 4 dozen rolls and 2 fried chickens and probably a cake or a pie, and everybody did the same. And the food was up there ready to burn almost. And now what was I talking about? I remember when Chautauqua Circle first came here, we thought what a wonderful thing it was going to be for the village, and it was. They would have the morning time, and they would go in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, and then in the evening. Almost everybody went. You paid so much, and I've forgotten how much we had to pay for a ticket that took you in all these meetings. And people walked from all over town. One time the tent was up on Railroad Avenue, and one time the last tent was down here on Harry Allen Park. And everybody went. People came in from the country, from all over. People came as far as Rush, from Mendon. They were here, and we had wonderful entertainment. That was before we had radio or television. We were glad to have anything for an entertainment. And the crowds would go, and they made it pay. I don't know why they gave it up. I have no idea.
Do you recall some of the famous men who spoke here at that time?
I can't.
William Jennings Bryan talked down here in Harry Allen Park.
Yes, sir, William Jennings Bryan did talk. He did, that's right. And there were other famous men, but for the life of me, I can't remember who they were. And they had,
Who was the author of Acres of Diamonds? He gave that talk here.
Yes, he did. Who was
You
it?
recall, Mother?
No, I can't recall. Who had all? I tell you, we had wonderful men here, but I can't recall their names. I might just well stay at home, I guess.
You've been listening to a little reminiscing by Mrs. Nellie Thompson on the things that have gone on in the history of Honeoye Falls.
U.S.
Several years ago, I remember there used to be a trolley line run from Lima through to Honeoye Falls. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, we thought it was wonderful when we could take it, get on a trolley way up on Railroad Avenue there and go up to Lima. And I remember going one night to a card party up at Dibble's house, and there were 20 of us. And my glory, I walked way from my house up way up there and didn't think anything about it, and so did everybody else all around town. Now they think they were killed if they walked that distance. And I also remember when the Lehigh Valley first came in, why, we thought that was grand to go over to the junction. It only came up as far as what they called the Y. We had to go up and get on there. And then when it came to Honeoye Falls, that was grand. Before this, we used to go to Rochester on the Central Railroad, on the Peanut Branch, and we would get up 6 o'clock in the morning and leave here before 7 and have to wait down to Gola Junction, probably an hour, and then go on to Rochester. We'd get home about 6:30 at night. Well, we didn't think anything of it, and then walk way home and get our meals, and I don't know how they did it. People think they couldn't walk now, quarter of a mile. If they walk 2 blocks now, they're tired out. Everybody is.
The Lehigh, as it came through, finally extended on through to Hemlock.
Yep, Lehigh finally went on to Hemlock, and then they thought that was wonderful. I guess they do go now once in a while, a train a day.
One train a day.
One train at night. You
Freight
can't.
only.
No, yes, freight only. You can't go because I remember when the Hemlock Fair and the train would be just loaded. You couldn't get any more passengers on.
And they run several trains a day.
Yes, they did. They ran several trains a day. You'd wonder why the old trains had to give out. I suppose now they want to fly, so of course they don't go on by rail anymore. I can tell and remember when we went to Rochester, we had one horse. It took 2 hours. If you had a fast horse, you could make it in 2 hours. We get up at 4 o'clock in the morning and get our breakfast and fly around ready to drive to Rochester. And that was a trip. Now, I don't think it wasn't. With one horse and buggy and...
Well, those were the days that were real rugged.
Yes, they were. And we could buy a good dinner down there for 25 cents at the hotel. That's all it paid, was the 25 cents for a good dinner. You didn't have salads, of course, but you had all the meat and potato you wanted, and dessert, just pie. We didn't have ice cream in those days. And varied. It would be impossible to recount them all. After the Seneca Indians had been conquered, western New York was deemed advisable for a white man's abode. In about 1788, exploring parties, one from New England states and one from Baltimore, to get the layout of the country around here, started out. In Albany, came to Syracuse, and then on to the Genesee country. They followed the Indian trails as much as possible. A large tract of land was purchased by Phelps and Gorham, who came from Connecticut about 1789. Captain Jonathan Ball was the first pioneer who bought 1,800 acres with water rights along Honeoye Creek, which had at this time an abundant supply of water fed by Hemlock, Canadice, and Honeoye lakes, and was a roaring stream most of the time. Ball became discouraged and homesick shortly after he located, and he sold to Zebulon Norton, who arrived in 1790 driving 2 yoke of oxen, 2 covered wagons, 1 horse with the household belongings, and the tools, guns, and millstones. Norton erected a saw and grist mill near the site of the Hamilton Mill. This soon proved to be too small, and a larger one built, which was destroyed by fire the same year. Then a third one replaced it. For nearly half a century, this little hamlet was known as Norton's Mills. During the year, Daniel Gates arrived, and he built a sawmill on the stream near the old Gates homestead. and he afterward gave some of that land to the North Bloomfield Cemetery, and 5 generations of the Gateses are buried there. As reports reached many inhabitants of the eastern states at this time of the fertile land, of wonderful timber and water power, many families, with neighbors and friends, left their homes and began their journey to the new country. The soil about here possessed a fertility which is unknown to the lands of the East. One writer states that grass grew along the Genesee Flats in 1792, nearly 10 feet high. Western New York was deemed the promised land of every New England Yankee. In 1794 and 95, 7 families moved in. Parks and Allen were among them. Sam Sterling arrived, and his son was the first white child born here. Julia Norton was the second. She died at the age of 3 and was the first person to be interred in our local cemetery, and this was in 1800. In 1796, a man named Moon located and cleared the land on the place now owned by Stanley Stever. The first marriage took place this same year when Mary Moon became the bride of Jason Cross. Records state that everyone in the hamlet, only 5 families attended. The cabin was so small they could not all get in, so they peered through the openings. In 1798, Jacob Young married a daughter of Zebulon Norton, and for a wedding present received the deed of the farm now owned by the Chase Brothers Nursery on Main Street, and it's now owned by Charles McCabe. In 1800, a road was opened up from East Mendon to Norton's Mills. From that time to 1805, numerous outfits passed through this area with immigrants from every part of the New England states. Gunsmiths and saddlers were kept busy by the traffic. Gamblers, speculators, and adventurers of every description made up the motley crowd. The potential water sites offered by the swift flow of Honeoye Creek induced many of these travelers in search of fortune to locate in this frontier outpost. Sawmills, distilleries, and asheries mushroomed overnight all along the creek. In 1810, a score of new families moved in, including among them was Smith, Burton, Yorks, Earl, Barnard, Ostrander, and Sanford. The houses up to this time are most of them rude, barren affairs made of logs. The pioneers held logging bees, and the settlers for miles around would come to assist a newcomer in the house building. Openings for doors were cut, and a blanket often used for a door, while sheets of oiled paper or hides of wild animals were utilized as windows. The construction of the log cabin was estimated to cost $50, and the sum of $100 would outfit a pioneer with oxen and cart and the two requisites of primitive agriculture, and also their household furnishings. A fireplace furnished heat, and also a place for cooking. About this fireplace centered the family, with the old spinning wheel at which the housewife spent all her spare moments, and where the babies of the household were rocked asleep in the old homemade cradles. These were hard-working folk who lived hand to mouth and always ready for whatever the day brought forth. Most of the men wore buckskin, and it was not unusual to see people barefooted with the early snow of fall. Traveling shoemakers made shoes for all the family, from hides tanned in the first tannery. This shoemaking activity was called whipping the cat. For recreation, the pioneers made social occasions of house raisings, huskings, and apple parings. Social lines were not sharply drawn, and all classes mingled together at those early frolics. Huge bonfires blazed in the opening, and about their warmth and light gathered the workers. with appetites whetted from the long day's work in the open. The dinner would be a huge pot of chickens, squirrels, rabbits, and any other animal that they could catch that was eatable. A good-sized portion of mutton and beef. This would simmer for hours to a succulent flavor in enormous black iron kettles. Beans baked in earthen pots, and all topped off with huge wedges of pumpkin pie. Oh, my nose. Great-grandmother went joyriding in ox sleds. Money was scarce, very scarce commodity, and many of those early settlers were so reduced in means they would cut bunches of shingles by hand, haul them to market, and exchange them for food. The shingles bartered were denominated Ashen bank bills. Ashes from the burning of timbers sold for 1 shilling per bushel, and was quite an industry. The wild animals, plenty of them, and game provided a variety of meat for food. Deer, bears, wolves, squirrels, rabbits, beavers, mink, raccoons, wildcats, and wildfowl could be slaughtered most any time in the early 1800s. The furs and skins provided warm clothing for the family. A century ago, nearly every family had 2 or more buffalo robes, and bearskin rugs were used as coverings for floors. The streams about here were full of salmon and trout. Vast quantities of hickory, chestnut, black walnuts, and butternut trees provided luxuries for the settlers, and maple sugar was used extensively for all purposes. The wild cherry was growing everywhere, which accommodated for so many pieces of furniture made of cherry to be found in western New York today. Grapes were growing in abundance, as well as wild berries, strawberries, raspberries, gooseberries, huckleberries, and cranberries. Fruit trees, including apple, peach, cherry, and plum, were found in some sections cultivated. The Indians had achieved a quality of agriculture bordering upon the civilized. Much ingenuity was used by those early housewives in finding substitutes for common staples. Coffee was made from burned corn and wheat, chocolate from dried Evans root, while tea was brewed from the bark of hemlock. Coffee and tea sold for 6 shillings per pound. Scarcity of salt for family and cattle constituted one of the most difficult problems of those colonial days. A carding and fulling machine was erected about 1808. This was the beehive of industry at this time. All day long the settlement rang with the sound of the woodman's axe and the clink of hammers on stone. With settlers pouring in from the east, it was deemed necessary to have a village board. So in 1813, a group organized to promote the business of the town. A tax roll at this time showed the tax on a piece of property was $2.25 for the whole year. Now the same property is about $200. A big flood in the early 1800s, when most of our bridges were carried away. The bridge on the 4 corners went out, and the taxpayers groaned when an iron structure was placed there, and most of the bridges on the little creeks were nothing but a huge tree cut down and thrown over the banks. No institution of American life has been more unjustly maligned by the public than the town pump, which every community, however small, had in the early part of the 18th century. It supplied substantial testimony of Earth's bounty. For years, with ostentatious dignity, one was utilized here, located between the Island Park and the Steamer and Hook store. An old rustic cup hung at its side and used by all the community. No one dreamed of the germs leaking around this receptacle. The people drank to their heart's content, and many of them lived over the fourscore year mark. The first hotel in the town of Mendon was located where Charles Lord's residence stands, and was owned by the name of a man named Parrish. Some historians state that Morgan wrote the famous expose of Freemasonry in the old tavern. Later, the building was moved to Mendon Center and used as a barn. The second tavern was built on the site of the O'Brien Brothers block on Ontario Street. In 1814, one day chickens went to roost in the middle of the day, when a total eclipse of the sun occurred about noon. Many of the inhabitants thought the end of the world had come. There was no telephone, radio, or press to warn them in advance of this approaching event. In 1822, found the villagers rejoicing over a post office. They may have been coming from Lima before this to West Mendon or Norton's Mills. At this time, East and West Mendon and Mendon Center were noted on the map. In 1821, Dr. Harry Allen rode into the hamlet with his saddlebag strapped on his horse. Those pioneer saddleback physicians would be amazed at the equipment of a modern hospital. One pair of pincers did duty for both man and beast when it came to trouble with teeth. Those early settlers did not summon a physician for minor ailments. Nearly every home has some kind of a doctor book, which is about the only reading matter they possessed. Many of those early physicians learned the art of healing from traveling over trails with a neighboring doctor, and then started out, no education much. In 1835, Albert Allen came and conducted a mercantile business. After a few years, he sold the stock and entered in partnership with Dr. Holland Allen and combined the sale of drugs with the practice of medicine. In 1830, Colonel Sibley employed about 80 men in Silverville and manufactured carting machines and agricultural instruments. The loom was a power in these times. Itinerant weavers moved from place to place, using the loom found in many homes. They would weave not only cloth to be used as clothing for the family, but coverlets as well. The wool, sheared, carded, dyed, and spun into yarn, was laid aside by the thrifty housewife until the weaver made his round.
Okay.
Apples were obtained from seeds soon after 1800. Previous to that, there were plenty of crab apples. The earliest religious group was Methodist, often referred to as shouting Methodists. They believed in hammering the Bible and pounding the pulpit to drive home the facts. Long sermons were necessary to save sinners, they thought, and the deacons should be exempt. Their meetings were conducted in a little church on the west side of Honeoye Creek. This was eventually destroyed by fire. Throughout the county, religion was taken seriously. Evangelists came from different fields, and the women from the household would listen to their exhortations. That's I had before. 1820, E.L. and W.R. Yorks built a foundry here and later enlarged the plant, which did a thriving business for years. In 1833, Sylvester Wilcox came and took command of the brick tavern, the present Masonic Temple. Dinners were served here for 13 cents. One writer asserts that shortly before 1832, Joseph Smith came to Mendon, bringing with him a couple of flagstones, which he claimed he dug out of the ground near Palmyra. In a house located near the hotel in Mendon, he wrote the Mormon Bible. While there, Brigham Young and a man named Kimball were his first converts. This Young was a cabinet maker, and a group of willow trees on the Hutchinson farm marked the site where he made the ladder-back chairs found in many homes in this locality. Many of the religious groups assembled in log cabins and were visited by missionaries. But they soon got tired of that, and a small frame building was then erected. Sermons 3 hours in length were not uncommon. Those first preachers of the gospel were emphatic in their descriptions of Hades, and many of the congregation could almost detect the odor of brimstone at times. Heating the place of worship was so inadequate that many of the women carried foot warmers to church. At night, hickory torches lighted the narrow paths as the settlers followed the trail through the forest. Possibly the long, lonely hours through the week was conducive to church attendance. In 1817, a Christian church was organized, and in 1826 a church building was erected 1 mile north of the village. The building is still standing and used for a horse barn on what was the John Finnegan farm. I couldn't think of his name. In 1840, the stagecoach days were in their prime. A paper carried this ad: Stagecoach leaves West Bloomfield at 6:30 a.m., Honeoye Falls 8 a.m., and arrives in Rochester 11 a.m. Leaves Rochester 2 p.m., arrives in West Bloomfield 7 p.m. A trip to Rochester required more than one to New York City today. One could drive 12 miles in the direction of Rochester and not pass a single person. In 1834, an epidemic of cholera in Rochester brought terror to Honeoye Falls residents. Less than a week after a river boatman became ill with the disease, 500 people were sick and dying. Even the clean country air of this village was thought to be filled with the deadly germs, and the inhabitants of the surrounding area were advised to wear bags of camphor around their necks and take quantities of boneset tea. Price of camphor doubled in a short time, but as the boneset grew in all swamplands, no scarcity was reported. During this middle of the century, great excitement prevailed in this area. There was little else talked about for weeks in advance. For July 25, 1853 was the great opening day of the first railroad. At daylight, the rural folk began pouring into town, and every tree and hitching post was utilized in all the streets. This event marked the beginning of a new era for the village. People and outside world came closer. The first school in the settlement opened up in a blockhouse about 1800. After 10 years had passed, a frame schoolhouse was erected where the residence of the late Dr. Otis stands. After a time, this was found to be too small to accommodate the children, and in 1826 a brick building was built on the bank of the creek having 2 rooms. This was surrounded by a high picket fence, and the only entrance was over a stile. The land was donated by Harry Allen. In 1855, when the town had 1,700 inhabitants, a stone schoolhouse was erected in front of the brick building with 3 rooms. School days, 80 years ago, had a glamour that has no modern equivalent. Not that the students of that generation had any burning enthusiasm for the 3 hours, but because of other attractions, the recess time and school adjourned. That made education worthwhile. All the children walked to and from school. There were no slick, shiny buses were there to solve the problem. There were no traffic hazards either. During the winter months, catching rides on bobsleighs provided amusement for both boys and girls. The discipline in those days was a problem. Sometimes the boys would put toads in the small girls' pockets and dip their long hair or braids in the inkwells, and occasionally a live frog would be smuggled in among the books, later to cause panic. If the lads were caught, no red tape about that punishment. It was swift and sure and painfully physical. Teachers received $1.50 a week. Most of them boarded around in the various homes. Sometimes the room was a one-room affair, with sleeping portions partitioned off by curtains. The guests would occupy one corner. In 1837, the stone mill on North Main Street was built. That's by Hiram Finch. The stone was quarried on the side. 10 years later, the Hamilton Mill was erected. There's some dispute over that, so I don't know whether that's correct or not. For years, these mills were designated as the upper and the lower mill. In 1828, Martin R. Pierce, a builder, moved in the village with his family. The Presbyterian Church is some of his handiwork. In 1836 and 37, the stone bridge on North Main Street was constructed. Up to this time, traffic from Main and Clover Street had to enter this village by the way of Hart Park. With the increasingly heavy traffic of that section at this time, this highway proved inadequate, and the villagers voted to build a bridge. When this was completed, it was considered quite a feat in engineering and was used for nearly a century. About 1855, Honeoye Falls is known throughout western New York as Hellhole or Murderville. There were plenty of characters about whom plays and novels might have been built, and they were not of the Sunday school type either. Whiskey was king, with 7 saloons near the Four Corners. It was a lusty, hard-drinking period. Violence and rife, and frequently riots would occur, and the miscreants were locked in a weather-beaten frame building on East Street, which is still standing. A notorious character in the village was a Mr. Caswell, who opened a livery stable near the site of Dr. Thompson's veterinary stand, and the horse market in the village was a scandal. According to local tradition, horses were piloted under cover of darkness to an underground stable, where white horses became black and black horses turned white overnight, and so skillfully was the dye applied that only an expert could detect it. When this man died, some ruffians entered the house and took the body from the casket, stood it in the corner of the room. All this helped to retain the name of Hellhole. Later, Mr. Wilcox kept an up-to-date livery stable. Much of the adventure and romance of the village was discussed there. Now at the village garage, successor to the livery business, there is talk of straight 8s and 80 miles an hour. But in those livery stable days, there was at least as keen an interest in how fast a bay mare, the sorrel, or chestnut, or the black team could travel over a country road. Life wasn't such a dull affair as one might imagine back in those pre-Civil War days. Everyone, as the pioneer expressed it, knocked off Saturday afternoon and had an afternoon of races, ball games, and feats of skill. This was always quite a sporting town between 1850 and 60 and 1900. Running races by young men frequently took place Saturday afternoons. The race would begin at the corner of Main and Monroe Street, over the highway to Moran's Corners, to Dan's Corners, and home, a distance of 4 miles. A colorful spot was near Dan's Corners, where a 2-room building was erected on the Livingston and Monroe County line. This was known throughout the country as the Gambling Den. When the sheriff from Livingston County would appear, the crowd would move tables, cards, and chairs to the room in Monroe County, and the games would continue. Nothing could be done about it, and vice versa. When the Monroe County sheriff appeared, the outfit would step over in the other county. In 1863, Francis S. Jory, an Englishman, opened up the great News Emporium on Main Street in an old frame structure on the site of the Dibble Seed Office. One could almost imagine a Dickens character had come to life in this Britisher with his broad Cockney accent. His short, rotund figure and florid face was topped off with a high silk hat, and he strolled daily about the village streets, flourishing a cane, while in search of material for his biting editorials, which he published in the newspaper, Honeoye Falls Free Press. As a side issue, he sold school supplies, paper dolls, and long sticks of peppermint candy, also monthly editions of Peterson's Magazine, and books with Mary Jane Holmes novels, the bestsellers along with the dime novels. The first street lights in the village were kerosene lamps. Every morning they had to be filled and cleaned, and every night at dusk a man walked from lamp to lamp, climbed his little four-round ladder, turned down the juice and lighted the lamp. Then about 10 p.m. went again to turn them out individually. An old account book states this was done for $100 per year. These were followed by gasoline, then gas, which burned night and day. About 1865, Philip Caulfield and his famous shoe shop, known all the country round as Tammany Hall, was located on the second floor of an old frame building on the site of the Lillibridge block on Main Street. The most philosophically minded of the male inhabitants of the town would gather frequently at this shop. Temple was unheard of. It promised all the intangibles of a modern club without the foul aroused. There were no home rules. Sometimes Philip would sit with his hammer upraised and his mouth full of shoe pegs and call the meeting to order. Discussion extended over a wide range: politics, religion, condition of crops, state of the nation, and local improvements. It is not strange that pure gossip was not on the agenda. The reason for that was anything of the sort was certain to hit someone in the gathering, either by way of blood or marriage. At election time, there was contention aplenty, enough to keep wits sharpened, and sometimes the cobbler would be obliged to use his hammer as a gavel when some of the group became a little too emphatic. Emily Gates sent me the description of the shop, which she had among some old letters of David Holmes, a former Honeoye Falls boy. He quote, "A large black wooden shoe hung over the entrance, directed customers upstairs in a room which had one dusty window, a coal stove, which did duty as a central heating plant, a pipe lighter, and a cuspidor. A shelf held clay pipes, Durham tobacco, and a sitting newspaper. Below the shelf was the wooden bench for customers or visitors, a few chairs, a checkerboard, and checkers. The members of the group were a little bit shifty in their habits, but the most dependable ones of my recollections were Squire Shannon, Judge Leavenworth, Captain Locke, and Major Donny. These men always wore shawls in extreme cold weather. Major Donny was a leading merchant here in this locality, where the cargo store is now located. The Hunt Brothers Woolen Mill did a thriving business here between 1870 and 90 and made 46 varieties of flannel and cashmere. 1865, Fred Hanford was clerking in a store for his uncle. Later, he carried on the business of dry goods and notions, and Mrs. Hanford made creations in hats and bonnets for all the women in the locality. A bank opened up in the village about 1868 by T.H. Holden and A.H. Martin. Hop raising was quite an industry here about 1880 on the Ben Pear Farm on Ontario Street. There were no houses at that time between the residence of Dr. Thompson and the Anson Briggs homestead. And later a fair was conducted on the site for a few years. About 1868, a waterworks line was constructed from Hemlock Lake to Rush Reservoir. Wooden pipes were first used, but found not usable, and iron followed. The digging by hand of the trench has brought a large force of men to this community, and they boarded or lived in camps along the line. Saturday nights was a gala time when these men congregated at the rural taverns, 6 or 7 located near the Four Corners. In some instances, overindulgence would seem to arouse their fighting instincts. And living in the village at that time was a family, the 4 men of which, father and 3 sons, were stout, rugged sons of Ireland. They were stonemasons, and after a time at the tavern, while